There are several different types of cells that are involved in making up the nervous system. So neurons are the primary cell that actually conducts nerve impulses so that communication can happen between one structure and another structure. So they tend to get the most attention since they are the primary way that the nervous system communicates between one structure and another structure. But neuroglia cells are actually just as important because they help the neurons do what they need to do. Also, neuroglia are also called glia or glial cells. So you might see some different variations of the term, but they all mean the same thing. So let's take a look at the neuron first, and then we'll talk about the different neuroglia cells and what their kind of more specific functions are. So as you can see, a neuron is a very distinct looking cell. It has a very special structure to it because it has a unique function to it. So the long nature of it allows the neuron to communicate over long distances within the body. So the cell body, also called the soma, is this area here. And that's where we find the nucleus and most of the organelles like endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, ribosomes, etc. The dendrites are these things that are little cellular extensions that are branching and sticking up off of the soma. And these are actually how the neuron receives information. So, for example, if one neuron stimulates another neuron, there are receptors in these dendrites for neurotransmitters, so that when a neurotransmitter attaches to one of those receptors, it makes the neuron respond. These dendrites can also be specialized to detect different sensory stimuli. So the sensory receptors in your skin, the sensory receptors in your eye, in your ears, in your tongue, in your nose, those are all just modified neurons that have a different kind of a different way of responding to stimulus. But regardless of how it works, the stimulus is always received on the dendrite side of the neuron. Branching off from the soma, there's also one long single cellular extension called the axon. So you'll notice that there are many dendrites, but only one axon. And as the information travels through the neuron, it always travels from the dendrites through the axon down to the ends here. And you'll notice that this axon has some stuff wrapped around it. This stuff is called myelin, and these are called myelin sheaths. And one of our neuroglia cells, the oligodendrocyte, is responsible for making these myelin sheaths. And we'll talk a little bit more about the structure and function of the myelin sheaths a little bit later on. The axon terminals, they're actually not labeled on here, but they're these branches at the end of the axon, and each one of them terminates in a synaptic end bulb. And these synaptic end bulbs typically meet up with another structure. So it would either meet up with another neuron or possibly a skeletal muscle or a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. Now, cell bodies and dendrites and axons and basically neurons in general, they tend to be bundled together. So there tend to be a lot of neurons bundled into a structure going to and from certain areas of the body. Now, the bundles of those neurons have different names depending on whether they're part of the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So first of all, the cell bodies and dendrites. So if we go back here, this would include this area here. So the cell body, the dendrites, and then these axon terminals that meet up with them would also be in that. So these areas where there would be a whole bunch of cell bodies and dendrites and these connections happening, In the central nervous system, it's called a nucleus, and this is different than the nucleus of an atom or the nucleus of a cell. So it's the same word, but it's actually, there are three different types of nucleus, and they have different structures and functions to them. So don't get that confused. In the peripheral nervous system, the collection or the cluster of cell bodies and dendrites is known as a ganglion. And then in addition to that, there are also axons clustered together. In the peripheral nervous system, they're known as a nerve, and you're probably fairly familiar with this term as compared to these others. And then in the central nervous system, a cluster of axons is referred to as a tract. So in this picture down here, we're looking at the underside of the brain. This is one eyeball and this is another eyeball. And each eye is connected to the brain by an optic nerve. And there's actually a spot in the brain called the optic chiasm where the information from the optic nerves kind of crisscrosses. And this is a key example of the name of a structure changing, even though it's kind of the same thing, it's the same information. But out here, where the eye connects to the optic chiasm, this is called the optic nerve because it's part of the peripheral nervous system. But this part, where the optic chiasm actually goes to the brain, is known as the optic tract because it's part of the central nervous system. Even though it's all the same neuron and the same kind of information happening there, it's called two different things. So moving on and talking about the different glia cells, as we mentioned, they help neurons perform their functions. There are 6 main types. 4 of them are found in the central nervous system, and 2 of them are found in the peripheral nervous system. So we'll start by talking about astrocytes, which you can see in the picture right here. And astrocytes have these cellular extensions that kind of reach out and they help to connect neurons to blood vessels and connective tissue. And several different functions. First of all, it helps to maintain the concentration of chemicals in the extracellular fluid. And this is really important because if there are extra neurotransmitters or sodium or potassium or calcium or something just hanging out by the dendrites or around the neurons in general, that could cause action potentials or nerve impulses to happen when they shouldn't. So it kind of helps to clean up the area with any excess chemicals that maybe shouldn't be there. And then as I mentioned, it also helps to remove excess neurotransmitters when they're not needed anymore. It also contributes to a structure called the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is a barrier between the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid. So blood does not actually touch nervous tissue in the brain. Instead, materials get transported or transferred between blood and cerebrospinal fluid, and then the cerebrospinal fluid acts as kind of the circulatory system for the brain itself. And this helps to really tightly control what types of substances can reach the brain and which ones can't. And this helps to kind of maintain that chemical environment so that the brain is only sending out nerve impulses when it needs to and not when it shouldn't. So examples of some things that can cross the blood-brain barrier are glucose, some amino acids, water, ions like sodium and potassium, and oxygen. And glucose and oxygen are primarily so that the nervous tissue can make ATP or energy. This blood-brain barrier helps to prevent things like toxins and pathogens from reaching the brain, which is great, but the bad thing is it also prevents white blood cells from reaching the brain, and this becomes a problem when trying to treat infections that have made their way into the nervous system. Another type of neuroglia cell is the oligodendrocyte, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Oligodendrocytes create myelin sheaths in the central nervous system. So the oligodendrocyte, the cell membrane, wraps around the axon of the neuron, and it helps to insulate the neuron, and it helps to speed up nerve impulses. So it makes these nerve impulses happen fast enough that they're more physiologically relevant. Microglia kind of act like immune cells in the central nervous system, so it helps to destroy pathogens. Ependymal cells are located in the walls of ventricles, which are spaces in the brain. And the ependymal cells are responsible for making and circulating cerebrospinal fluid. So there's actually a specialized area called the choroid plexus where ependymal cells produce cerebrospinal fluid, and it gets the material for the cerebrospinal fluid from the blood. So this choroid plexus, made up of ependymal cells, filters the blood to produce cerebrospinal fluid. And then there are cilia, which are little cellular extensions that can kind of sweep in a wave-like motion, and it helps to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid because there's no pump that's moving it around. Instead, the cilia help to kind of almost like brush the fluid around the central nervous system. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, there are satellite cells that are very similar in function to astrocytes. And the peripheral nervous system also has cells that produce myelin sheaths, but instead of being oligodendrocytes, they're called Schwann cells. But they both make the myelin sheaths. They're both responsible for helping to speed up nerve impulses.